Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Maaser Sheni. We're up to Perek Gimel, Mishnah Yudbet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilum Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Minuchatam Began Eden, Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to discuss whether a container filled with Maaser Sheni takes on Maaser Sheni sanctity. The Mishnah begins, Hamashin Kankanin le Maaser Sheni. Someone lends his containers for the storage of Maaser Sheni wine, and the containers are filled with wine. Afal pish gafan, even though he closed the containers after filling them. Lo kana Maaser, the Maaser Sheni does not acquire the containers, meaning the containers do not take on Maaser Sheni sanctity. Zalaf letochan stam. If, however, someone poured ordinary untithed wine into the containers and then designated the wine as Maaser Sheni, the status of the containers depends on the following. Ad shelo gafan, if he designated the wine as Maaser Sheni before he closed the containers, lo kana Maaser, the Maaser Sheni does not acquire the containers and they remain chulin. Mishe gafan, but if he designated the wine as Maaser Sheni after he closed the containers, Kana Maaser, the Maaser Sheni does acquire the containers and they take on Maaser Sheni sanctity along with the wine inside of them, because once the containers are closed, the wine and its container are considered a single unit, with the container being tafel, subordinate to the wine. So therefore, when the wine becomes Maaser Sheni, the container takes on sanctity as well. Therefore, if he wants to redeem the Maaser Sheni wine, he must redeem the value of its container as well, says the Rav. For example, if the wine is worth 10 shekels and the container is worth 5 shekels, he must redeem them for 15 shekels, which he will spend on food in Yerushalayim. But the Mefarshim explain, if he chooses instead to drink the wine, if he chooses instead to bring the wine to Yerushalayim and to drink it there, the containers remain sanctified until the wine is consumed, and then they automatically will return to chulin status. But in the Mishnah's first case, a person poured wine into a container after the wine was already designated as Maaser Sheni. So in that case, the container does not take on Maaser Sheni sanctity, even if he later closes it, because the container can take on sanctity only if the wine is consecrated as Maaser Sheni when the container is subordinate to it, meaning when the container is closed. The Mishnah now is going to discuss other halachot involving containers filled with consecrated liquids, where the status of the containers depends on whether they are open or closed. The first case involves jugs of tirumah wine that became mixed up with jugs of ordinary wine. So as a rule, if tirumah becomes mixed up with chulin, the entire mixture must be treated as tirumah unless there is 100 times more chulin than tirumah. Like the Mishnah told us in Masechet Tirumot, chapter 4, Mishnah 7, if there is 100 times more chulin than tirumah, the tirumah becomes nullified and the entire mixture is treated as chulin. The Mishnah discusses how this relates to a situation where a container of tirumah wine became mixed up with containers of chulin wine. Ad shelo gafan, if containers of tirumah wine became lost among chulin containers before he closed the containers, olot be'echad u'mea, the tirumah containers are nullified in a proportion of 100 to 1, meaning if there are 100 parts of chulin wine to 1 part of tirumah wine, the tirumah is nullified and all the containers are permitted to one kohen. Umishe gafan, but if the tirumah containers were lost among the chulin containers after he closed them, mikadeshot b'chol shen, the tirumah containers prohibit the entire mixture, even in the smallest amount, meaning even if one closed barrel of tirumah wine is mixed up with 1,000 barrels of chulin wine, the entire mixture must be treated as tirumah. The reason being, because a closed container of wine is considered an important object, davar chashuv, and an important object can never be nullified, even in 1,000, no matter, like we said, no matter how much chulin is mixed up with it. And the Mefarshim explain, if the containers are open, the container and the wine are each considered a separate item. Therefore, the wine is treated like any other tirumah wine that was mixed up with chulin wine, meaning it is nullified if there is a proportion of 100 to 1. If the containers are closed, though, the container and wine are considered a single unit, and such a unit of container in wine, like we said, is regarded as an important object, davar chashuv, and an important object can never be nullified no matter how much chulin is mixed up with it, like the Mishnah tells us in Masechet Orla, chapter 3, Mishnah 7. Therefore, all the containers must be treated as terumah and may be used only by a kohen. In the next case, a person has several containers of tevel, untithed wine, and he wishes to separate terumah from them. The rule is that when a person separates part of his produce as terumah, that terumah must be touching or near the produce for which it is being designated. For example, a person has 2 piles of grain. If the piles are next to each other, he may separate terumah from one pile on behalf of the produce in both piles. If, however, the piles are not near each other, terumah taken from one pile cannot satisfy the terumah obligation of the other pile, and terumah must be separated, therefore, from each pile. The Mishnah now discusses how this applies to containers of wine. Ad shelo gafan. Before someone closes his containers of wine, he may separate terumah from one container for all the others. If the containers are open, the wine inside them is considered near all the other wine in the room, and the terumah can be taken from one barrel for all the rest. However, after he closes the containers, he must separate terumah from each container separately, because once the barrels are closed, each barrel is considered its own unit, unconnected to any other barrels in the room, and therefore terumah cannot be taken from one barrel for another. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah Yud Bet. Mishnah Yud Gimel continues, based off what we just learned, that a person may not separate terumah from the wine in one closed container on behalf of wine in another closed container. This Mishnah discusses a case where a person has already closed his barrels of wine and now wishes to separate terumah from one barrel on behalf of the others. Bet Shammai say, if someone closed his barrels of wine, but now wish to separate terumah from the wine in one barrel on behalf of the wine in the others, mifatech lagat, he must open all the barrels and pour the wine back into the wine press, because Beit Shammai hold it is not enough to merely reopen the containers. He must combine all the wine into a single vat, and only then may he separate one portion of terumah for all the wine. Because Mefarshim explain, after the containers are closed, the wine in each container is not considered near the wine in the other containers. And Beit Shammai hold, in order to restore the status of nearness, of being next to each other, all the wine must be poured into a single vat. But Bet Hillel say, Mefatech v'eno tzarich leharot. He may just open the containers. He does not need to pour all the wine back into the wine press. And Mefarshim explain, Bet Hillel hold that once the containers are open, the wine in each container is once again considered near the wine in the other containers. The Mishnah now returns to the laws about containers that are filled with Maaser Sheni wine. The previous Mishnah taught us that if someone designated tevel wine as Maaser Sheni after its container was closed, the container itself also becomes sanctified as Maaser Sheni. The Mishnah now is going to limit that ruling. B'met dvarim amurim. When were these words said? Meaning, when do containers of Maaser Sheni become sanctified along with their contents? If it's designated as Maaser Sheni after the container is closed, bimkom shedakan limkos tumot. That's only in a place where it's common to sell wine in closed containers, because in such places, a container is generally included in the sale of wine, and therefore a wine's container is considered tafel, subordinate to the wine. So because of this, the container can take on Maaser Sheni sanctity along with the wine. But the Mishnah now is going to discuss when this rule does not apply. So to do this, the Mishnah is going to repeat a law that it told us in chapter 1, Mishnah 4, with regards to a person who uses Maaser Sheni funds to buy wine in a container. The Mishnah there discussed whether the container takes on Maaser sanctity, aval bimkom shedakan nimko ptuchot, in a place where it is common to sell wine in open containers, meaning the wine is usually measured out and sold without a container. If a person uses Maaser Sheni funds to buy wine with its container, lo yatsa kankan lechulin, the Mishnah said the container does not become chulin, meaning it takes on Maaser Sheni sanctity, because since a container is not usually included in a sale of wine, and this sale does include a jug, it's as though the jug is being purchased separately with part of the Maaser Sheni money, and since it's bought with Maaser Sheni money, it takes on Maaser Sheni sanctity. This halakha teaches us that in such a place, a wine's container is not considered subordinate to the wine, because if it were subordinate to the wine, it would not be regarded as being purchased separately, but would have been included in the sale of the wine. So accordingly, in our case, where a person designated wine in a closed container as Maaser Sheni, the container does not take on sanctity with the wine, because it's being tafed, it's being subordinate. Now that we reviewed the rule that where wine is sold in open containers, the purchase of a container is viewed as its own purchase, and the container takes on Maaser Sheni sanctity, the Mishnah gives us an exception to this rule. If the seller wishes to conduct himself more precisely and sell the wine by exact measure rather than by a container, because Mefarshim explained generally wine was sold by the jug or barrel, the seller sells it by this seller wants to sell it by a more precise measurement, by exact amounts. For example, 10 ounces for dinar, the container becomes chulin, meaning it is not sanctified as Maaser Sheni, because since the seller specifies a price for the exact measure of wine in the container, he implies that the container itself is not included in the sale. If he gives the buyer the container, it's like a free gift in addition to the purchase of the wine. Since it was not bought with Maaser Sheni money, it does not take on any sanctity. Now, the next Tana returns to the previous subject and teaches us another exception to the rule that we said in Mishna Yudbet, that when wine in a closed container is sanctified as Maaser Sheni, the container becomes sanctified as well. Rabbi Shimon says, a person designated most of the wine in a closed container as Maaser Sheni, but left over some wine as chulin. And the Mefarshim explain, he designated the wine in a closed container as Maaser Sheni, but he stipulated that a small portion of the wine should remain chulin. The container therefore holds both chulin wine and Maaser Sheni wine. Even if this person says to his friend, we are going to read the brackets based off the Rav. He changes several words here. Even if this person says to his friend, Yain ze ani mocher lecha chutz mikan kanah, I am selling you this chulin wine without its container, since I need the container to hold the Maaser Sheni wine that remains in it. The container becomes chulin, meaning it is not sanctified as Maaser Sheni, because even though the seller specified that he's keeping the container for the exclusive use of the Maaser Sheni wine, the container does not become sanctified as Maaser Sheni, because when he designated the wine as Maaser Sheni, the container also held chulin wine. Only a closed container that holds nothing but Maaser Sheni wine can take on Maaser Sheni sanctity along with its contents. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. The Rav explains to us before we finish that Yerushalmi learns Rabbi Shimon is explaining the Tana Kama, not arguing on him, but he's explaining what the Tana Kama discussed when he said, Im mishagafan krashem maaser kena maaser, that if when you closed it, you assigned it, designated it as Maaser Sheni, it becomes Maaser Sheni. The Rabbi Shimon is really explaining that Tana Kama's opinion. He's not arguing, and that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen v'amen.